So my name is Arieh, and my thesis paper was on Jewish responses to the Armenian genocide. Okay. So the Armenian genocide is the second most well-known genocide in the 20th century, falling right behind the European Holocaust that exterminated European Germany for several years. And it should be noted that in this genocide, the perpetrators were the Ottoman Turks, who massacred 1.5 million Armenians during World War I. And it should be noted that the 1.5 million Armenians that were killed constituted 1/3 of the entire Armenian population at that time. So it wasn't on the exact same numbers as the Holocaust, but it was still very significant. But before I can discuss any details regarding the Armenian genocide, it's important to look back at the relationship between the Armenians and the Ottoman Turks. So the Armenians were a group of Christians, or a sect of Christians, that lived in a country called Armenia in the Middle East, and that can be seen in the picture right over there. And for several centuries, the country of Armenia faced invasions from larger and threatening empires. And in the 15th century, that included the Ottoman Turkish Empire. Now, in the empire, the most well-respected citizens were Muslims, and any other ethnic group, including Jews and Christians, were considered Maleks, or secondary citizens. Now, these Maleks could live normal lives and could get any job, usually any job that they wanted. The only problem was they had to usually pay a very high tax in order to go on living safely. And they were often attacked by bandits and robbers without the government or any police force helping them. And this treatment went on until the 18th century, when the Armenians started hearing about Western ideas, like political and philosophical ideas, like representation and democracy. And so the Armenians decided to go to the Sultan, and the Sultan was the leader of the Ottoman Empire, and they asked whether or not he would implement these reforms in the country. Now, the problem was the Sultan did not want the Armenians to be on the same footing as the Muslims. So instead, he orchestrated a massacre called the Khamidiyeh massacre. And what happened was he sent Kurds, and Kurds are another group of Arabs that were living in the empire at that time. And they went into different Armenian villages, and they shot as many Armenians as they could. And within a span of 2 years, 100,000 Armenians were killed this way. Now, fortunately, there were several groups in the United States that heard what was going on and decided to ease the Armenian suffering. This included the Red Cross that helped any of the wounded. There were American newspapers that circulated the news, and there were also religious bodies like churches and synagogues that raised enough money so that the Armenians could get back on their feet safely. However, the most unique response came from a man named Rabbi Stephen Weiss, shown over here. Rabbi Weiss was the leader of the Armenian Relief Campaign in the United States, and he was also an advocate for social justice. And he used these skills to have a meeting with a group of American rabbis called the Central Conference of American Rabbis in 1909. And he framed out a proclamation to give to European countries at that time. And this proclamation stated that there were Armenians being mistreated by the Turks, and there were also being Jews mistreated by the Armenians, and that nobody was lifting an eye or even responding. And what was unique about this response was Weiss was essentially elevating the concerns of the Armenians and the Jews and putting them on the exact same foot. That everyone should be aware of what's going on to these people. Unfortunately, Armenian life was just about to get worse in the country. In the year 1908, the Sultan was deposed from power and was replaced by a political group called the Young Turks. Now, at first, the Armenians were supporters of the Young Turks since they advocated social reform throughout the empire. The problem was the Young Turks wanted to create an empire only run by Muslims, and that non-Muslim people would not be a part of this new system. And the Young Turks would take Christians that were living throughout the empire and started deporting them into Syria. So the Armenians were very worried. And at the exact same time, World War I began in 1914, which pitted Turkey against Russia. And it should be noted, as seen in the map over here, that there were Armenians living on both the Russian and the Turkish side. and that both sides joined their own retrospective armies. However, by 1915, Turkey was losing the war badly and was facing military defeat after defeat. And instead of the Turkish leaders focusing on fixing those errors, they cast the blame on the Armenian people. And these Turks said, these Armenians in Turkey, they're joining their brethren in Russia. They're betraying our country. We shouldn't trust them. So these Armenians got their ranks stripped and they were forced out of the military. And this was the first incident of the Armenian genocide. It officially began on May 1915 with the temporary law of deportation. And this law stated that anyone who was treasonous in the country had to be deported. And in the eyes of the Turkish leaders, that included all the Armenians. So the Armenians, within a span of a week, had to gather all their supplies and family members and assemble in the middle of their village or square. And in turn, they had to be shipped onto caravans, and they were forced to march in the middle of the desert to Syria. And the main problem with these marches, though, was that it was relentless. It lasted all day, and they couldn't stop for barely any time at all. Because if they did, the Turkish guards could shoot them right on the spot. To make matters worse, the Armenians didn't bring a lot of supplies with them. So they faced malnutrition and starvation very frequently. And it was very common to see an Armenian on the side of the road eating grass while suffering from dysentery at the same time. And to top things off, the Turks would have fun with the Armenians that they were controlling through burning them alive. And what happened was they were taken into caves, empty caves, and the entry would be sealed by a wall of flame. So that the Armenians would either starve to death in the caves or would be burned alive trying to escape. Fortunately, this genocide was not greeted with just silence, and that there were several Jewish responses to this genocide. And the most famous Jewish response came from a man named Henry Morgenthau Sr. Now, Morgenthau was a very wealthy Jewish American who had a deep love toward politics. And he used this love to help finance Woodrow Wilson's political campaign so that Woodrow Wilson would become president of the United States. And in turn, Wilson offered Morgenthau the position to become the American ambassador to Turkey during the war, to which Morgenthau agreed. And while he was in Turkey, Morgenthau noticed Turkish brutality to the Armenians. And at first he was concerned about the Armenians, but he didn't want to help them out. He felt it was not his concern. That all changed when he started receiving telegrams from his staff, which stated the Turkish plans to cause the Armenian genocide. And Morgenthau realized that he was one of the only people who knew about this, and he had to make a choice, and he had to make a stand. And he decided to help the Armenians out. And he had 3 different plans to attempt to help alleviate the concerns for the Armenians. His first plan was to try broadcasting the telegrams that he received. And Morgenthau accomplished this by sending the telegrams overseas to the US State Department. And in return, they sent it to the American newspapers so that the news would circulate and everyone would know what was going on in the Middle East. His other plan was to try raising $1 million to give to the Turkish government. And he hoped that the Turkish government would take the money and then would send 550,000 Armenians from the country to the United States so that they would be safe. The only problem was the Turks did not want to follow through with this plan at all, and they hung 20 Armenians in the center of Constantinople in response. And to top things off, Morgenthau was desperate enough to even schedule a meeting with one of the leaders of Turkey. And one of the leaders was named Talat Pasha. Now, the Pasha was one of the leaders who formed and created the Armenian genocide. And Morgenthau was trying to make sure that he can get the Pasha to mitigate the effects. Unfortunately, the Pasha would not budge at all, and he refused to change any detail. But even though Morgenthau tried desperately, and even though 2 out of 3 of his plans failed, he still nevertheless was making leaps and bounds and trying to help as many Armenians as he could. Now, another Jewish response came from Jewish women who went to Syrian prison camps. Now, prison camps were the equivalent of European ghettos at that time, where whole Armenian families were forced to move into very congested and squalid lifestyles and communities. And it was at these prison camps where these Jewish women offered to buy Armenian children from their parents. And at first glance, this seems completely terrible. I mean, why would these women want to buy children and have them be taken by complete strangers? However, this practice was necessary since life in the prison camps were brutal. The only thing people faced there was starvation, death, and torture. So the Armenian children would be safe this way if they went with the Jewish women. At the same time, there were also Turkish and Arab women who wanted to buy Armenians as well, and Armenian children as well. And the problem was, if the Armenian children went with those women, they would try converting them to Islam or try forcing them to marry Islamic suitors. So the Armenians would lose their heritage and suffer what is now known as cultural genocide. So the Armenian women were trying to rescue these children from both physical and spiritual fate. Now we have to fast forward to the year 1918, which was when World War I ended and where the Ottoman Turkish Empire was defeated. And at this time, all death marches and all prison camp activities ceased and screeched a halt, and they all stopped. And the victorious Allies put a man named Mehmed Vaheddin in charge of the country. And he desired that there should be a military trial for the Young Turks for their genocidal actions. The problem was Vaheddin wanted this trial because he was afraid of Allied retaliation. And he was afraid that the Allies would come and harm any Turks for causing this genocide, which was not true at all. Now, this military trial took place from 1918 until 1919. And interestingly, this would be considered the first crimes against humanity trial in all of history. And at the trial, Ottoman leaders and 120 wartime cabinet members were convicted of initiating the Armenian genocide through both oral and written documentation. And this included any accounts of death, rape, or also seizure of Armenian property throughout the war. And with all this evidence, it was possible to have these Turks sentenced to life in prison or death. The problem was, in October 1919, the proceedings stopped altogether because Turkey was suffering from birth pangs. Now, for people who don't understand, when the Ottoman Empire was defeated after World War I, it was broken up into several pieces. And only one state remained, which was owned by Turkey. And the only competent leaders who could lead this newly founded country were the Ottomans who caused the genocide. So as a result, all these Ottoman leaders were exempt from their punishment, and the military trial proceedings stopped. So as a result, the Armenian genocide has never been truly vindicated. Now, to this very day, the state of Turkey does not state that the Armenian genocide ever occurred. And for people who do believe that there was a genocide, they cast all their blame on the Armenians. And these Turks stated that these Armenians during the war joined the side of Russia. So, they betrayed their country, and they were seen as wartime cowards, so they got what they deserved, right? Completely wrong. Instead, the Armenians should be seen as valiant heroes, because they were portrayed that way in a book called The 40 Days of Musadah. Now, as seen in this slide right over here. And The 40 Days of Musadah was written by an author named Franz Werfel. And he was a German Jewish author who wrote this book during the 1930s. And The 40 Days of Musadah was based on a real-life event where a group of Armenians made a camp on the bank of the Mediterranean Sea. And this camp was called Musadah. And it was there that they stood their ground during the war, and they prevented any Turks from coming over and attacking them. And when the war was pretty much over, the Allied navies came over, and there were a group of Frenchmen who had small boats, and they rescued nearly all the Armenians there and brought them to safety. At the same time, it should be mentioned that Franz Werfel wrote this book in 1933, which was the exact same year that Hitler rose to power in Germany and started the persecution of the Jews there. So as a result, Franz Werfel's book was not only for the Armenians, but also for the Jews to stand up for themselves during harsh times. Now, I would like to thank Professor Freund and Professor Pat for helping me find all the sources and to formulate this wonderful paper. And I would like to thank Professor McLaughlin, who is not here unfortunately, for helping me revise this paper and get it done in all neat and proper. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming here today.